All right, so just to wrap things up, I'm just kind of going to say, well, where is Jim G going with all this stuff? Okay, so he's laid out kind of differences between primary and secondary discourses, differences between acquisition and learning, and we've already started to think about discourses as functioning largely as an identity kit. Okay, so kind of right towards the end of the article, he's kind of wrapping up. Finally, decides, okay, now it's time to answer this question about what literacy is, and what G offers is the definition that literacy is control over use of language in a secondary discourse. Okay, and I would kind of expand that in certain regards, and just me adding to it. But I would say that it's not simply kind of just the control of the language use, but I think that part of that literacy involves kind of ways of knowing and being in the world. Okay, because I think that language use is intimately connected to kind of forms of knowledge and ways of being. So they kind of like ontological and epistemological functions of this. Okay, so he kind of then keeps going with this discussion of like, okay, so if we understand literacy as control over kind of involvement in secondary discourses, we also need to think about dominant forms of literacy. And in terms of dominant forms of literacy, those become really one's ability to participate in dominant discourses. Okay, so if you, for example, can't articulate the ways of knowing things or understanding things, or the enactments of particular discourses that are connected to power, then you're just kind of some person on the outside. Okay, so in order to kind of have that access to those dominant literacies, you have to be able to kind of participate within those structures. So some people can participate in those structures and not even be aware of it. Okay, again, that's some of that difference between acquisition and learning. Right, we'll talk more, for example, about code switching in this class. Right, so that it's something that we all do. Okay, every single one of us. And for some of us, code switching may be more or less, extreme than others. Okay, for some of us, code switching from being with friends to then being in school at a university, we might behave very similar in both instances. Others of us, we might have, like who I am, for example, when I'm with, my friends and family is very different than who I am when I'm, being a professor, making YouTube videos, apparently. So I think that one of the things we need to think about in terms of not only kind of the kind of dominant forms of literacy, but also kind of powerful forms of literacy. And the powerful form of literacy involves being the ability to both kind of act and critique and discuss these kind of discourses, for example. So on one hand, you might be completely oblivious to the fact that different forms of power exist, right? Hierarchies that exist within institutional structures. We could think about constructions of race or gender or sexual orientation or ability, and I could go on, but all those things are imbued with power, and someone could be oblivious to that, or someone can be aware of those structures, and that part of what powerful literacies entail, according to Jim G, is being able to not only be aware of it, but also have the language and ability to kind of interact and critique. Okay? So you can critique something from outside of it, but you're often positioned as unreasonable, for example, or ineffectual, or if we were to read the French philosopher Foucault, it would be considered madness. But again, it's part of the powerful literacy is being able to kind of point to things that exist that maintain those kind of structures. Okay? And again, we'll talk more about this. Okay? But to really master a discourse is something that comes through acquisition, not being explicitly taught, right? And I think again, we'll come up with some examples when we meet in class, but there's like an authenticity to some of this, right? We can tell when someone's playing a particular role, right? Or they're like, you're not being real. Okay, I think that's probably the best way to put it, right? We can tell when something's real. We can tell when someone's from a certain place, or, right? I mean, I'm from Philadelphia originally, and it's like just like similar to Detroit here. I mean, there's a distinction between people who are from Detroit and people who aren't, and people who play that they're from Detroit and people who are from the suburbs, and it's like there's a difference there. I mean, like, but again, I think that those are things that we can be aware of. I'm just trying to like come up with some examples off the top of my head. Okay. But again, to master a discourse is something that really involves acquisition. And for it to involve acquisition, it's not like, oh, here are the rules about how to play this game, right? It's like, how can you actually kind of take them on? And I think we should critique that as well in certain regards. Okay? But I think that again, where we kind of leave off in this piece is to kind of think about how it's difficult, if not impossible, according to G, to challenge a discourse as it stands unless you have the kind of meta level knowledge of that discourse and others. Okay, so unless you can actually point to this as being something, right? This is something that's acting discursively, we can't really critique it. I think that again, we'll talk about some examples. Usually some of those come up around kind of experiences about learning in school, kind of how you've been kind of positioned or marginalized, or how things have just seemed natural or easy. But again, those things are different. Okay. So I think I'm just going to kind of leave it there. I appreciate you hanging in for this video. It was long. This is a dense article, and again, what I'm hoping is that this kind of offloads some of the drier aspects of just kind of covering the vocabulary of the reading, where we can actually spend class time really kind of thinking about examples and working towards, kind of thinking about how this will impact our work in the classroom. Okay, so I'll leave it there. I know this is a long video. I'm hoping you're all doing well, and I'll see you all on Tuesday. Have a good time. Have a good evening the rest of the week.